Pointing to the blackboard, on which hung a poster with some information, he said that there was an explanation of the colors of the envelopes with assignments, which he had to look at and choose the right one. There were 4 colors in all: white, blue, red and black, each of which was responsible for the difficulty. The easiest errands were in the white envelopes. The mission in them was within the island, while the possibility of meeting the priest was 0. The hardest errands were the ones in the black envelopes, because the limits of the mission were in the entire Holy Federation, while meeting the priest was guaranteed. Dick also told Simon not to take any assignment that was too easy, as his grades depended on it. This was the difficulty of choosing missions in Kizen, because you had to choose the best mission that would fit your goals and priorities. Then pointing his finger at the protagonist, Dick added that if he failed the grades on the mission, he could forget about dangerous tasks. In addition, delaying too long will not work, even though the assignment has time. And as a result, he would simply be expelled for failing grades. Simon answered fearfully that he would do his best and would not put it off. When he had finished explaining, Dick waved goodbye and said that they would meet when he had decided on his assignment. Simon agreed, thanking him for the information. Walking between the students, who were busily looking for companions for joint missions, Simon pondered which mission he should choose. Turning to one of the students who was handing him a mission sheet, he wanted to look at it, but Fayer immediately told him not to accept it, since they would definitely have to leave the island. Then adding that their priority should be to be able to get to the continent, all in order to gather soldiers for the battalion and restore the former glory. Hearing his words, Simon asked him with interest if the undead were stronger than him. He replied in an indignant voice that he was the leader of the battalion, and no one was stronger than him. However, he then added that some battalion generals were real monsters. Hearing Fayer's words about generals, the protagonist was surprised, as he had never heard of anything like that before. Turning to Fayer, he asked him to explain more about battalion ranks. Sighing, he immediately began to explain, saying that the battalion consisted of several undead units, while it was ruled by an ancient undead who had intelligence. Hearing this, Simon asked with his eyes sparkling with excitement and joy, if he thought it was right that their goal was to find the ancient undead representative who could become the general of the battalion. Fayer replied that it was exactly like that. Then when the protagonist asked him where to find them, he told him not to worry, as they were all crazy and were probably making a mess on the continent right now. This news didn't make Simon very happy, but he decided to keep silent. Not wanting to delay, Fayer offered to take a closer look at the errands as he remembered all the characteristics of his former soldiers. Passing by the board on which the missions were hung, Simon thought that the island assignments were out, because if there was one of the undead on the island, that the battalion commander would immediately inform him. Then he turned to him and asked him how the mission went and if he saw anything interesting. To which he replied that there was nothing there, telling him to go to the Reds. Heading towards the board where the red difficulty level missions were hanging, the protagonist suddenly bumped shoulders with someone. It was none other than Hector. He coldly looked at Simon and greeted him. He asked if he was also going to the neutral zone. He answered in an uncertain voice that he just wanted to take a look. Hector did not pay attention to his words. Cold voice reminded the protagonist that in the neutral zone established lawlessness, and the influence of Kizen there did not work, which meant that no one will know if someone gets into trouble. After that, he left and added that he hoped that they would meet during the mission. But suddenly Simon called out to Hector, who immediately turned his head at the sound of his voice. Then, with a slight smile on his face, he told him to watch himself. Hector was shocked and furious. Simon turned around and walked towards his original goal, leaving the enraged classmate standing alone. On the way, Fayer asked him what was wrong with that guy, to which Simon replied that he had no idea either. After glimpsing a few missions, he asked his interlocutor what he thought about the village being attacked by infected zombies. He replied that the infection was too common, even an ordinary necromancer was capable of such a thing, then added that all the missions had nothing to do with the general's abilities. Suddenly, however, Fayer's attention was caught by a blue leaf that was hanging on the board below several red mission sheets. When Simon saw it, he first thought that it had been put there by mistake. However, when he got closer and read its contents, he realized that there was a higher level of difficulty. The assignment was to investigate a missing persons case. The level was upgraded from D to B and the fee was 50 gold. In the details, it was reported that young girls were found in a state of completely desiccated corpses. After reading this, Fayer immediately asked the protagonist to show him the detailed materials of this assignment. Looking at the photos, Simon shockingly exclaimed that they were indeed completely desiccated, while Fayer laughed and said that it was exactly what they needed. He added that it was probably the one he was thinking of. Hearing his words, Simon asked who he was talking about. Fayer replied that the one he was talking about was one of the ancient undead leading the spider squad, and her name was Elizabeth. At the same time, a man stood near the table on which several pictures of desiccated girls were lying, and turned to his interlocutor and asked if he was sure he could handle it. The man in a white cloak with a hood covering his face, respectfully addressed the man and replied not to worry, as it was the will of the great goddess to save the people of the continent from the undead. After which he took off his hood. A teenage girl with medium-length white hair and violet eyes said in a confident voice, in the name of the Holy Father and the Goddess, that she was Ellen Zyle, a sophomore at Ethnal Holy College, who would handle the situation. When he reached the door to Professor Jane's office, Simon paused for a second and exhaled decisively. He knocked and told the professor, who was sitting at her desk writing something, that Simon Valencia had arrived. Hearing his words, she said he could come in. She asked him if he had come for the mission, to which he replied that he had. As soon as the professor asked him to give her a sheet of paper with the mission he had chosen, he immediately put it on the table in front of her a little nervously. After a glimpse of the mission, and then continuing to write, she told Simon to take another mission, since this level of difficulty was too much for a first year to handle. Such a quick rejection shocked the boy a little. However, he did not intend to give up so easily, so the next moment he said in a firm voice that he wanted to take it no matter what, because he was sure that he would be able to cope. Hearing his words, the professor only grinned. Then, under Simon's puzzled gaze, she signed his mission. She handed him the assignment sheet and told him that he probably had a reason to say that to Professor Kizen's face, but then added that he didn't need to convince her. Looking at the confused Simon, she said that he was a student of Kizen's, so all he had to do was take responsibility for the outcome. Then the professor added that she hoped he would live up to his words. A pleased Simon, with a smile on his face, thanked her for believing in him. When he returned to Dick, who was waiting for him in the corridor, he happily told him that Professor Jane had let him go, but from the look on his happy face one could have guessed it all. After a while, Simon and Malin stood near the teleporters that sent students to different places. The girl asked him if he was really going to take up the mission, as she had already told him that it was very difficult to do the investigation in 5 days. But he didn't say anything else, just thanked her for her advice. She blushed and replied excitedly that she hadn't given him any advice, and it wasn't like that. Simon smiled and asked Malin where she was going to go. She replied with a smile on her face that she had taken a personal security mission near Langerstein. She added that despite the fact that it was quite easy, she got good grades for it. When Simon asked her what she would do if she encountered thieves, she lifted her robe and showed her academy badge and proudly declared that if they had brains, they wouldn't dare touch a Kizen student. To which he remarked that it sounded a little cowardly. The girl replied that it wasn't cowardly, and that was why everyone was sending an errand to the academy. Malin waved goodbye to Simon and said that they would see each other next week. Simon waved back and wished her luck. As he approached his teleporter, he noticed the girl who was already sitting inside waiting to be sent out. His appearance surprised her. This girl was none other than Cern. With a smile on her face, she greeted Simon and said that they hadn't seen each other since the performance ceremony. She then formally introduced herself with a smile, saying that her name was Cern Eindark, the official heir of Ivory Tower, and special admission number 2. Simon sat down across from her and replied that his name was Simon Valencia, and he was from Les Hill. After a second of awkward pause, the girl turned to the protagonist and said that she had heard that he was looking after Malin. She added that she might be harsh, but deep inside she was very kind, and then asked him not to refuse or betray her. However, Simon's reaction puzzled CERN, as he asked her in a cold voice why she was telling him that. And someone like her shouldn't be underestimated or defended, because she was doing just fine on her own. The silence was broken by a voice announcing that the teleportation device would be activated soon, and also warning the passengers not to step outside the boundaries of the device during the teleportation. Dissolving, CERN smiled and replied that they would see each other again. Simon also teleported and appeared in the city that was his destination. Finally saying goodbye to the girl, tired and exhausted from their conversation, he noted that she was under a terrible pressure, as if he were talking to a queen or noblewoman. Since Malin was also from Ivory Tower, he could understand her concern, but he was troubled by the way CERN treated her. His musings were interrupted by the voice of Feyer, who, being dressed in knight's armor that made a terrible grinding sound when he moved, irritably asked Simon why he had given him such small armor that was terribly tight for him. He replied that there was no other, and that was all that was left, since he couldn't just show it to people. Hearing the guy's answer, he swore irritably. Not wanting to waste any more time, the protagonist took the materials out of the envelope and asked the battalion commander what they had to do now. He replied that the basis for the completion of their mission was to collect information, and the only way to collect information was to meet with the client. Following Simon, Feyer told him that their client was the lord of this city, so they just needed to tell him that he was from Kizen and then find out all the information they needed. But since he still hadn't figured it out, there was probably a reason for that, and that was why this option wasn't suitable for them. The other option was to go on a run. Pointing a finger at the protagonist, who was walking thoughtfully, he said that he used to do a lot of similar things on missions with his father. Then, continuing to creak his armor, he added that from his own experience, he could say with certainty that it was the fastest way. Simon replied that it all sounded cool and interesting, but they only had 5 days. Hearing the guy's words, Feyer suggested that they should resort to the last method, which was to buy information from the Thieves' Guild, or as they called it, the Information Guild. Simon replied that this was probably a good option for them. Then he added that in that case they should start looking for the Information Guild right now. The battalion commander said that they could ask the innkeeper or pub owner about it. To which Simon, with a smile on his face, enthusiastically replied that then they should hurry up and fulfill the mission as soon as possible. Entering the inn, they were immediately greeted by the owner, who was standing at a table waiting for customers. Tossing a bronze coin to the owner, he informed them that they needed a clean, spacious room, as well as breakfast and some bread. After taking the payment, the owner gave the protagonist the change. But he did not accept it, saying that in return he would like him to tell him where the Thieves' Guild was located. A little hesitantly, the owner asked what had brought them here. Simon folded his hands in front of him and asked the man if this was how they talked to customers. Then tossed a coin on the table, he asked for information in return for a gold coin. At the same time Feyer grinned happily, as he was pleased with Simon's actions, who in his opinion was acting beyond his years. Seeing the strange knight behind the boy grabbing the hilt of his sword, the innkeeper frightenedly asked if they were really talking about the Information Merchant Guild. Simon slapped his hand on the table and added in a confident voice that he still needed information about the missing people incidents. After that, emitting a confident atmosphere, the strength of which was added by the fearsome knight threatening with his sword, Simon demanded that the owner tell him everything he knew. As the sun began to set and the sky was colored pink, Simon walked down the street and said he was glad they had found out everything. Feyer, who was following him and still rattling his armor, replied that it was a great move and that it would make things go much faster. Looking at the information sheet, Simon read in his voice that most of the missing were men, but only the girls were found in a mummified state. Furthermore, there were no signs of molestation on them either. Hearing this, Feyer replied that the one they were looking for used to kidnap guys and have fun with them, while the girls she wasn't interested in had their blood sucked out. And all these events were exactly in her style, which made him sure that Elizabeth was in this city. Entering the right bar, Simon and his somewhat strange knight went straight to the bartender, who immediately greeted them. When the man asked what he would like to order, Simon started digging in his pocket, saying that he had heard about their special menu. Then, placing a silver coin on the table, he asked the bartender if he could sell it to him. He agreed and said he would take them to the right place. They went down a rather gloomy staircase into the cellar, guarded by several men armed with crossbows. The man opened the door for them and invited them to enter. They entered a rather well-furnished room, in the middle of which stood a table and which was lit by many candles. Simon and Fair were greeted by an attractive woman with long yellow hair who was wearing a red dress. She smiled at her guests and asked what could have brought the foreigners to her guild. Simon simply replied that he had come to buy information. The guild leader asked him what information he wanted. Simon replied that he wanted to know about the missing people and mummified corpses, all the information the guild had about the case. The woman put her hand under her chin and looked at the protagonist thoughtfully. Then replied that it would be very expensive, and such a thing is unlikely to be able to afford a first-year Kizen. These words shocked the protagonist a bit, as he could not understand how she knew who he was. Seeing the guy's reaction, the guild leader laughed loudly, telling him not to get so worked up, adding that it was just a deduction. Since the lord of these lands wanted to resolve this situation very badly. And for that, he had sent out many errands to different places, which made her certain that they had gotten into Kizen. Then, under Simon's gaze, she continued talking. She said that as he could see on the way here, there were lands of small areas, so their lord didn't have enough money to hire a necromancer from the main headquarters, so he only had to look for students. She leaned close to Simon and told him that the students arriving at this time were first-year students. But despite the woman's behavior, he remained unperturbed. Then placing his hand on the woman's hand, he said that it was an interesting proposition, adding that he couldn't try his luck in such a case. Taking the guild leader's hand and raising it in front of him, he exuded a cold atmosphere and said that there were dangerous events happening in their area, and just like she said, their lord must have asked many people for help. Then without releasing her hand, he added that many of those people had indeed accepted the errand and came to her guild. However, none of them ever made it. As a result of which, this receipt fell to him. Even though the same thing had been happening for the past few years, no one had even had any thoughts about it, let alone solve the problem. Looking at the guild leader with a cold gaze, he asked if she thought that such a small amount of available information was very suspicious. Adding that he would even say that everyone was confused because of someone's clever lies. However, even despite the seeming accusation in her direction, the woman remained silent, her emotionless face continuing to stare at the guy. Simon continued, saying that in that case it made one wonder about the incompetence of the Thieves' Guild, but adding that he didn't think that was the case. Since if one thought back to all the things they had encountered before, she didn't seem like an incompetent person at all to him. "Am I wrong?" the protagonist asked in a cold voice, putting his hand behind the woman's neck. Then grabbing her head and bringing it close to his own, he demanded that she tell him the truth before he turned the place upside down. But to Simon's surprise, she didn't panic. She apologized with a smile and asked him to let go of her hand, which he agreed to do. Taking a step back from Simon, the guild leader said that it seemed she had no choice if they wanted the truth so badly. But she warned them that the risk for that information would be on their shoulders, and then asked if they still wanted to know. To which he replied that he was ready to take responsibility. When she heard his answer, she told them to wait for a minute and then she left. As soon as she was gone, Simon, pouring sweat and sighing heavily, said that it had been very long and hard for him, but that they would probably succeed now. And if they could find out where Elizabeth was. He couldn't finish, however, because Fayer standing next to him started laughing. And in the next second he burst into loud laughter. Seeing this, the protagonist was puzzled and asked him what was wrong. He replied that he wasn't completely sure at first, but now it was obvious. Adding that he should take a broader view of things. The words of the battalion commander did not help Simon to understand anything, and he asked again in bewilderment what he was talking about. At the same time, the man who stood behind them had his arm in an unnatural position, while his face contorted. After that, spider legs began to emerge from under the skin that had begun to slip off the man's face and struggled to get out, while many red glowing eyes could be seen from the holes that had already formed. "That woman is Elizabeth," shouted Fayer in response to the protagonist's question. The next second, as if out of nowhere, a multitude of spiders began to appear. When Simon saw them, he asked what kind of spiders they were. Feyre answered that they were the woman's children, namely corpse spiders. There was the sound of footsteps, after which Elizabeth appeared. She turned to the protagonist and said that his strong will had impressed her. Then, with a smile on her face, she added in a cold voice that unfortunately they would not see each other again. Her face had undergone some changes, the skin on the left side of her face had partially peeled off, and in place of one eye, 3 eyes had appeared at once. In addition, several spider tentacles appeared from her back. When Simon saw this, he shouted to Feyre to start acting. He grasped the hilt of his sword and told Simon not to worry. Then, with a strong but smooth motion, he swung his sword, and as a result, the crowds of spiders were killed or thrown away in an instant. Hearing the voice of a knight in armor who shouted her name, Elizabeth immediately recognized the battalion commander. Feyre pointed his finger at her and in an irritated voice asked her what she was doing and what her plan was in this petty little town. Then he added that the battalion was back, so she had enough of this nonsense and had to go back. With a playful smile, she listened to the battalion commander. Then opening all 3 of her eyes wide, in a voice of terror and hatred, she replied that she was not coming back. Then turning to Feyre, she said that he was quite stupid. Suddenly the ceiling cracked, threatening to fall. The next moment, the debris, along with countless spiders, fell on Simon and the battalion commander. The protagonist screamed fearfully, while Feyre ordered him not to panic and dodge. Elizabeth said in a cold voice that Richard had used them and threw them away like garbage. Then she asked him, in a voice of resentment and hatred, why he still clung to the battalion after all the shame they had suffered. He replied, after killing another spider, that she was the only one who was stupid, and that her dirty thoughts must have contaminated the affairs of men. Then, in a firm voice, he added that the battalion was strength and will. And how could a general like her give in to such pathetic emotions? Hearing this, Elizabeth replied that Richard had pushed aside his partners, with whom he had fought shoulder to shoulder for decades, sending them into a death trap, all for the sake of some girl. Simon hiding behind Feyre's back, he watched their conversation with a concerned face. Exuding a cold terrifying atmosphere, the spider headed towards our heroes, adding that she despised him to death. Hearing this, the battalion commander sighed heavily. The next moment, a sword flew straight into Elizabeth's face, which she immediately blocked with her spider paws. Throwing the sword, Feyre told her in a cold and angry voice to stop being stubborn as he was not going to put up with her selfishness anymore. Catching the sword that returned to his hand the next moment, he asked how dare she defy the battalion head. Then swinging the sword again, he asked if she had forgotten the days when she crawled after him like a dog. Sensing the danger, Elizabeth with a tense face grabbed her spider threads, preparing to repel the attack. The next moment, Feyre swung his sword with force, while the spider-woman swung her arms and threw a web at him, which, like a net of blades, flew towards her opponent. After the explosion that was caused by the collision of their attacks, Elizabeth mockingly told Feyre that he was a good talker, yet was much weaker than her. Standing on the roof, and looking down at our heroes through the hole in the ceiling, she added that his seal had most likely been broken recently. Seeing her turn around to leave, the battalion commander asked her irritably if she was just running away, to which she simply replied that they would see each other again later. Then turning to Simon, with a radiant smile illuminated by the bright moon, she added that they would also meet him soon. As soon as she left, the protagonist turned to Feyre and told him that the entire Thieves' Guild was Elizabeth's gang, to which he confirmed that it was, adding that it was easier for her to control the information. Feyre swung his sword and chopped up another spider, swearing and complaining about how many of them there were. The next moment he heard a voice, which made Simon raise his head. A girl stood on the roof where the spider had been a few minutes ago, and she said in a frustrated voice that she was sorry she hadn't been able to watch the deadly battle between the two monsters. Then raising her staff, she said that she would go after her when she finished them off. The next moment, the stone at the end of the staff glowed with a bright blue light. When Simon saw this, he cried out in surprise, while the girl smilingly waved goodbye to them. After that our heroes were swallowed up by the bright light. When the smoke cleared, the priestess saw that there was no one there, but she wasn't too upset about it. She had missed the boy and the soldier, but that didn't matter. She was determined to go after the monster to fulfill the order. Meanwhile, Simon and Feyre hid from the priestess' attack in the depths of Erzsébeth's lair. They were surrounded by many withered corpses and cobwebs. Feyre was not happy about dragging the priests into this mess. Simon was in agree with them and didn't catch how it had all come to this in the first place. He wondered how they were supposed to find Erzsébeth now. Feyre reassured him that she had to be somewhere nearby. After all, after using the skills, her darkness was tangible enough, and for the moment he could track her. If they went after that darkness, they would surely meet her sooner or later. Simon was glad they had that opportunity. But he was worried about something else and asked Feyre how strong was that priestess. Feyre thought for a moment, then answered that she was certainly stronger than Simon. And judging by her white uniform, she was from Ethnal and had probably accepted a mission equivalent to a black assignment from Kizen, which meant she was definitely not a first-year student. Simon thought, then he would definitely need to be outraged that the Lord had sent the errand to different schools twice. This case was getting more complicated than a simple blue assignment, and he had to do everything in 5 days. These thoughts gave him a headache. Feyre ignored it all and said that there was still something else he needed to know, but he shouldn't take it all to heart. Erzsébeth loved Richard. Simon's jaw dropped at this news. Feyre told him that once the undead of the battalion had fallen in love with a human commander. When she first joined them she had been through too much emotion. But he never thought she could develop real feelings. Now it was clear to Simon why she had reacted to him that way. Now that Feyre had made it clear to him, he advised him to go look for Erzsébeth sooner rather than later, and he himself had nothing against it, but in the corner something among the cobwebs stirred. And when the unfortunate captives noticed them, they began to beg for their release and rescue them from the spider monster who had left them for his supper. Simon immediately ran up to them and helped them free themselves. The captives were very grateful to him for this. Feyre, seeing all this, said that he was too soft as a necromancer. Simon asked if he was. What did he think a necromancer should have done? Feyre replied that it sounded like his father's answer. Simon didn't quite understand what he meant and asked again. Feyre only smiled in response and said that it was nothing. After all, if that was what he decided as the head of the battalion, he would gladly support that decision. They set off together on the trail of Erzsébeth's darkness, but they didn't have to walk long. Not far from the city, in the woods among the ruins, they quickly found her. She was sitting and waiting for them. Feyre picked up on the fact that she had decided not to run away. Erzsébeth stood up and replied that since he sensed her darkness he would have followed her anyway, so she decided to deal with them here. But before she could attack, Simon stopped her by addressing her formally. Erzsébeth, former battalion general. She froze in place, waiting to see what he would say next. Simon formally invited her to join his battalion. But she only laughed in response and said she would never go back to the battalion that had already betrayed her once, even if she had no choice. She came closer and closer to them, tapping her heels. Erzsébeth continued, claiming that he was asking her to follow his orders, the orders of a rookie, without favorable terms and chosen only for silly sentimental reasons. Simon responded by asking her if he had said anything about his reasons. He introduced himself to her, that his name was Simon Falentia and he was the son of Richard Falentia and Anna Falentia. She was shocked to hear this. Simon started to say that she was his father's subordinate. But she asked him to stop. Her body was twitching and her skin was starting to crack. But he kept saying that he was now his son and the current battalion commander was offering her back. She screamed at him in rage to stop. Simon repeated that he wanted to take her back to his battalion, but she yelled back at him to shut up. She started screaming horribly, remembering that damn girl Anna and everyone else who had betrayed her. Her skin began to unnaturally stretch in different places, ready to tear at any moment. Until it finally ripped, releasing 3 pairs of spider legs. Erzsébeth had turned into a huge spider and now wished them all nothing but death. She screamed in rage for them to just die. Her eyes burned with anger and hatred. And she immediately took a leap at Simon, who was standing in front of her. And was cocky enough not to dodge. And when her sharp claws almost reached him, Faya praised him, saying that it wasn't bad. The armor holding him back crumbled with a creak of metal. And in the next instant, he was chopping off the spider's legs before it could reach Simon. Elizabeth hadn't expected this. She was blinded by the rage and lust for revenge that was now causing her to lose her legs. Blood spurted from her severed limbs and she screamed in pain. Simon saw this as his chance. He quickly pulled out a spear from his subspace. And grabbing it, he amplified it with darkness and rushed towards Elizabeth, preparing a powerful strike. In the next instant, he pierced her shoulder with the spear. And with a thud, he brought her to the ground. She only moaned in pain. He pressed her face to the stone floor with his foot and told her it was her last chance. He asked her one last time if she would join his battalion or would she prefer to die. She just laughed in response. But then something whistled at him and he barely had time to dodge it. And if it wasn't for Faya's sword, the next shot would have hit him for sure. Faya cursed, this was bad, Simon had to get out of here. Faya grabbed him by his uniform and dragged him away. The next moment a flash of light hit them and Simon was unharmed only because Faya had his back to him. Simon didn't yet understand where the holiness had come from here, but it was pretty clear that it was very close, a perfect timing hit. It was the same priestess again, who was now holding a staff and preparing another spell. She joyfully announced to them that the old evil spirits, the disgusting swarm of spiders and all the others would be banished here and now. She tossed a ball filled with holiness in her hands. And after saying bye-bye to them all, pointed the staff at them, which shone brightly. That light was destroying all the spiders in its path. Simon seeing all this asked, what should they do? Faya advised to attack the priestess first. Elizabeth meanwhile used the commotion to hide behind a nearby rock. Simon meanwhile asked if they could defeat her since she was strong enough. Faya replied that holiness would be a problem, but she wasn't that strong and they could defeat her, he would take her attack and Simon would have to attack her. That plan suited him. The priestess meanwhile noticed the wounded Elizabeth and liked what she saw. Seeing her severed legs, she realized that she didn't seem to be doing too well. Elizabeth knew it herself. The priestess began to spin her staff and cheerfully told her that she need not worry, for she would send her to hell painlessly. She raised the staff above her and it glowed with a blue light forming a magic circle above her. The priestess was sure that with this attack she would complete her mission and finish off the spider. She stared in horror at the face of death flying at her and couldn't move. But then suddenly a silhouette appeared in front of her and covered her. It was Simon, who had taken the brunt of the blow. Elizabeth couldn't believe what she was seeing. Elizabeth didn't understand why he had sacrificed himself for her. Simon fell to the ground with a thud, groaning in pain, the energy spear of holiness still in him and hissing as it began to disappear. Drops of blood fell one after another onto the stone floor, and he barely held himself up to keep from passing out. But even so he couldn't hold on much longer, his vision blurred and his body began to shake. The next moment he fell senselessly to the floor, unconscious, and all that was in front of him was endless darkness. Somewhere far away he heard the cry of Faya calling him, boy. After a while, a fire was burning brightly among the ruins creaking with burning wood. Several figures were gathered around it. Simon slowly opened his eyes to the sound of a bonfire burning. The atmosphere was so quiet, that chaos a while ago felt awkward. As he moved his head, he suddenly saw a multi-eyed corpse spider right in front of him. As soon as his vision focused on it he immediately shrieked in fright. But the spider didn't attack. Rather, it rubbed its face on Simon's arm and looked up at him as if asking if he was okay. This only frightened Simon more, and he immediately jumped up and threw the spider off his arm. Faya was glad he was finally awake. The first question Simon asked, not realizing what was going on around him, was what happened to Elizabeth and the priestess. Faya mundanely pointed his finger in their direction and said they were all here. They were still inside that abandoned castle. Those terrifying spiders were quietly crawling around the floor near their mistress. Elizabeth had returned to human form and was sitting quietly nearby, near the priestess who was entangled in cobwebs and hanging upside down. She was desperately trying to get Simon's attention. And now she was calling him young master, where all her arrogance had gone. The priestess was desperately begging to be let live, sobbing and screaming for all she was worth. Thayer saw the incomprehension on his face and decided to explain to Simon that he had missed something while he was unconscious. Thayer and Elizabeth formed a temporary alliance to face a common enemy, working together to capture the priest. According to Thayer, it was a very boring battle, as the girl was only from Ethnol's high school. The priestess was swaying in different directions and screaming the whole time, making Simon feel uncomfortable. So with a nervous smile he offered to bring her down to the ground and interrogate her. Since the lord of these lands had contacted both Kizen and Ethnol, it was imperative to find out what she knew. She was no longer a threat to them, so Elizabeth released her in one motion. The priestess fell to the floor at the end and began to thank them all tearfully for sparing her and freeing her. But Simon stopped her and advised her not to be too hasty with her thanks, for she had several questions to answer. The first question was if she was a student of Ethnol. She immediately answered that she was not at all. To Thayer this answer was expected, and he noticed that she was lying from the first word she said. Simon thought so too, since she was wearing her school's uniform, which he pointed out to her. The priestess replied that it was a fake uniform. Her answer surprised them. Either she was a masterful liar or still telling the truth. She explained that she was actually expelled from Ethnol 2 years ago, or to be more accurate, she didn't even manage to finish her first year. After that, she started taking various commissions to earn money for her living. That's why she pretended to be a student of Ethnol, so that the customers would trust her more and pay her more. She desperately apologized to them, trying to convince them to spare her. Elizabeth snorted contemptuously and asked if she really thought they would believe that. And then added that she was just looking for an excuse for the situation. She then abruptly walked over to her and yanked the sleeve of her robe, which immediately ripped. The girl shrieked in surprise. It was not the result Elizabeth had expected, and she stared at the torn piece of cloth. It was indeed a normal cloth. But from what she had heard, Ethnol's form was supposed to be as strong as Kizen's. The priestess repeated that her form was not real. It was indeed a confirmation of her words, so Simon walked over to her with his cloak in hand and suggested she cover herself with it and forgive them for this behavior. Simon helped her put the cloak on and asked her what her name was. She replied that her name was Ellen Zyle. Elizabeth was watching from the sidelines, and she was shaking with envy, rage, and the realization that she had seen it before. Simon ignored all this and continued to question Ellen. He wanted to know how she had accepted the assignment without being a real student of Ethnol. Ellen replied that she just bought it from the border guards. They told her that there were undead associated with the case, and that it was located within the Dark Alliance and paid well for it. And she agreed because, like Kizen, Ethnol offers more money for missions within enemy territory. Simon understood her motivation and asked if she had met the local lord. Ellen answered him that yes, she had personally taken the mission from the lord. Then he asked if she had any corroboration of her words to back her up, maybe some document describing the details. Anything would do. As they chatted so sweetly, Elizabeth couldn't believe her eyes. She didn't understand why she had to go through all this again. She had just forgotten everything and hoped never to remember again. Well, now again before her eyes Simon was sitting and talking to Ellen, and it all looked exactly the same as it had in the past. When Simon's father Richard sat and talked to his mother Anna, she had witnessed it all too. She thought she had long since forgotten everything and would never remember it again, but that was not the case. It turned out that even monsters like her could truly love, and the wounds left by that love were too strong to forget. While Simon continued to talk to Ellen and asked if he could take the contract from her, and if she would give it to him, he would handle the rest. Elizabeth clenched her fists at the painful memory. Thayer asked Simon why he wanted to do all this. He told him that he was going to meet the Lord and wanted to get what he could from him. When Thayer heard his answer, he laughed and said that it was all very well and that the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Simon sighed tiredly and said that everyone should go. When suddenly Elizabeth asked if his name was really Simon Valencia. She wasn't going anywhere until they had settled one thing. Thayer and Simon looked at her questioningly. She continued by saying that his offer to join the battalion. She was willing to accept it. However, she had one condition. Hearing this, Simon shuddered at the thought of what she could possibly want. And then she immediately pointed at Ellen, who shrieked in fright. Elizabeth wanted him to kill that priestess with his own hands. The poor girl was horrified at such a condition. Simon stood towering over them, as if choosing which side to take, and his face showed no emotion. After a moment's thought, he asked if Elizabeth really wanted him to kill Ellen. Upon hearing this question, a satisfied manic smile appeared on Elizabeth's face, and she confidently replied that yes, it was her only condition. She thought he had already made his choice and was anticipating the show. Simon started from afar and addressed her formally. Elizabeth, former general of the Spider Forces. Tell me why I should kill Ellen. Elizabeth replied that by doing so he would show himself and prove his resolve. In this way she would want to know that her leader was worthy of her loyalty. Simon froze for a moment, then asked in a cold voice, "And why exactly? I should deserve your loyalty." Elizabeth had not expected such a question. She looked at him with incomprehension and asked if she had heard him correctly. Pretending not to understand what he meant, Simon continued and said that he thought she was deeply mistaken, and even though she had once belonged to his father's battalion, it didn't change anything because he wasn't his father. Faye listened thoughtfully as Simon continued to say that he would create his battalion by personal standards and reasoning and based on what he had seen so far. Elizabeth did not fit those standards. For her, such words were like a cold shower and she didn't know what to say back. Simon continued and explained to her that as a member of the Undead she was consumed with negative thoughts, too easily given to emotions and not paying attention to the important things. And then looking at Ellen asked what would he prove by killing her. He suggested that Elizabeth simply admit that she does what she wants and only seeks to control it based on her own impulsive and vulgar desires. A shadow enveloped her face and she couldn't find anything to answer. But Simon kept going and finally added that he couldn't trust such a creature. His new battalion didn't need people like her. And without even waiting for her answer he turned and left, calling Faye and Ellen with him. They immediately followed him, glancing nervously at Elizabeth. Simon said goodbye, that they had wasted their time here. He said it loud enough for Elizabeth to hear. She was left alone in the ruins under the moonlight, shocked by what she had heard and unable to believe that someone else had been chosen instead of her again. They headed back to the city together to pay the Lord a visit. They walked through the dark forest, filled with the sound of night creatures, each of them silent and thinking about something different. The silence was interrupted by Faye, who asked if he was really going to leave Elizabeth out of his battalion. Simon answered him that no, of course not, it was all to gain power and supremacy in their relationship. Elizabeth is clingy and has a tendency to do things her own way. And so he had no other choice if he wanted to control her in the future. Faye was intrigued by his answer and incredulously asked if being impaled by the holy spear was also part of his plan. Simon smiled in response and said he wouldn't comment on that. Hearing this, Ellen began to apologize, saying that she was really sorry about the attack. But Simon looked at her and assured her that it was okay, because she hadn't even been aiming at him then, so it wasn't her fault. Ellen asked incredulously if he was sure, as she remembered the holy spear had gone straight through his chest. Isn't the necromancer's core centered in his chest? If his core is damaged it could end badly for him. But Simon reassured her that everything is perfectly fine and he doesn't think it went through the core. Simon's words reassured Ellen but didn't hold Faye, who knew for sure that the spear had gone exactly through the core, but he didn't understand how he could be fine after something like that. He looked at his hand in darkness checking if they were okay. It turned out they were. It turns out that not only was Simon fine, but more than that there was also no effect on their contract. None of this seemed possible to him, and he was beginning to doubt that the spear had hit his core and he had just gotten lucky. It was all rather mysterious. Simon noticed that Faye had fallen behind in his thoughts and asked him what was wrong and hurried him up. Faye replied that everything was fine and he would catch up with them right away. They were just approaching the castle of the local lord. When Simon entered the castle and the lord himself came to greet him. He pretended to be very happy to see him and said that he was honored to have such a high-ranking guest. The man introduced himself as Count Raymond, the Lord of Arnish. Simon introduced himself in return as well. The Lord escorted him to the living room where the table was already set. He said that Simon must be exhausted after such a long journey. After all, he had to come all this way because of his request, and he wasn't sure if he could repay such kindness. The Lord invited him to make himself at home, to rest and let go of his fatigue. He assured him that he would try to make him as comfortable as possible. Simon smiled and replied that he couldn't say that he was tired, since he had arrived here through a magical teleportation circle. The Lord pretended to be surprised and said that Kizen did indeed live up to his name. Since that was the case, he offered to serve him dinner and asked him to sit down at the table. But Simon was in no hurry to accept his offer and replied that dinner sounded good, but he wanted to talk about his request first. The Lord sat down in his chair and laughed nervously, saying that this was all important business, of course, but it was getting rather late. And he had heard that the life of a Kizen student could be very taxing, so why not take a good rest when he had the chance? The Lord's behavior seemed strange to Simon. And when he raised his hand to summon the servants and tell them to bring drinks and food, Simon stopped him by saying no. And imperiously announced that he had important business to discuss with him personally. The Lord realized that there was no way he could get away with it and sighed tiredly, saying that he was sorry to tell him this when he had come all the way here, but that the matter was already settled. But he was grateful for his time and interest and was willing to pay the fee for the case. Lastly, he advised him to get a good night's rest before he left. Simon was not going to agree to his terms and told him that it was strange because according to the information from the guild, the incident related to the case had happened this morning. Therefore, he couldn't accept the payment because he hadn't fulfilled the terms of the request. In the future it might be a problem for the two of them if Kizen sent an inspection later. The Lord was beginning to lose patience and a grimace of anger crossed his face. And when Simon asked why didn't he just say what was really going on around him and what was wrong with his request. From that he clenched his fist and began to ask in a menacing voice. Why can't he just stay put when he tells him to stay put? And hitting the table furiously added that he may be with Kizen, but he's just a freshman. He immediately called for the guards while continuing to shout that he had no right to rebel against him, a count and the lord of this fiefdom. He couldn't understand why Simon was making such a fuss about it, since he was paying him anyway. The guards surrounded Simon and pointed their weapons at him. But he remained calm and asked the Lord why he first gave him sweet speeches and now he was trying to intimidate him with threats. What a strange determination. And he even used his guards. While he was saying all this, then he imperceptibly clenched his fist, calling Fair for help. And when Simon said that in that case he couldn't just sit there, Fair appeared behind him with a squad of skeletons. Which scared the hell out of the Lord and his guards. They started trembling and were ready to flee at any moment. The battalion commander, pulling out his sword, said in a cold voice that they were welcoming some new family members today. Looking at the terrifying skeleton that loomed over him, the Lord was frightened to the point of terror, wondering how a freshman at the academy could have so many undead. He fell to the ground in a panic, realizing that he was in for a rough ride. Simon took the initiative and asked the Lord in a cold voice if he wanted this to continue. But he didn't seem to realize the situation he was in. The next thing he knew, he was shouting at the guy in an irritated voice, asking how dare he treat him like that, because he was a nobody. He continued yelling and added that even if he was a Kizen student, he still had no right to interfere with the autonomous rights of the Dark Alliance, nor did he have the right to use his power without proof. To which Simon asked the one, did the one really think that they had no proof? The next moment, Fair opened his cloak of darkness, from behind which Ellen's head appeared. Seeing the girl, a look of shock appeared on the man's face as he couldn't believe his eyes. In front of him was the girl he had also hired for this assignment. Her hands were bound while her gaze was blank. Ignoring Lore's shock, Simon explained to him that while they were investigating the case, they had captured a priest from Ethnal who was currently under a curse and was unconscious. Adding that they would have no problem getting the information they needed from her if they sent her to Kizen and interrogated her. A look of despair appeared on the Lord's face. But Simon continued, saying that bringing a priest to this place would be considered treason. Then, with a sly smile, he leaned in and asked if he was wrong. The Lord had no answer to that and fell to his knees in despair. Hitting his head on the floor, and continuing to stand like that, he began to apologize, saying that he had to solve this case no matter what. His words left Simon bewildered. The Lord pleaded in a trembling voice, saying that his men were in a panic, and so he wanted to solve this case as quickly as possible, no matter what methods were used to do so. Then asking for his men to be spared, as he was the one who had to bear all the responsibility for his actions. Hearing this, Simon asked him why he had tried to keep it a secret if he cared so much about his possessions. He replied that their business environment was finally becoming stable, and the crown prince was expected to visit their domain soon. But if such atrocious incidents were to continue, then all prospects could be forgotten. After hearing the Lord's words, Simon couldn't help but agree. The Lord continued, saying that he had tried to deal with it as best he could, contacting Kizen and all the mercenary groups, but the matter was still not resolved, so he had to contact Ethnal. He added that he never thought a real priest would come. Simon replied with a smile that he had. The next moment, the Lord hit his head on the floor again and asked them not to punish the others, but only him. To which the protagonist replied that he now understood why he had done so. Folding his hands in front of him, he said that this city was a strategic point that was closest to the Holy Federation, so he would hate to see such an important place destroyed, adding that he also liked this city. The Lord stared at the protagonist in bewilderment and asked him what he was talking about. Simon replied that he would solve the case in such a way that it would not cause any problems for their city. The man and his soldiers smiled happily as they heard this. However, Simon added with a smile that it might cost them a bit. However, the Lord didn't care about money, and he immediately replied that he would prepare as much as they needed right away. But suddenly their conversation was interrupted by a soldier who ran into the room and panicked and said that they had a problem. Namely that a lot of undead were standing near the castle. These words perplexed both Lord and Simon. Climbing the castle wall and seeing an army of spiders with someone standing in the center, the Lord panicked and asked where all the undead had come from. Without answering the man's question, Simon put his hand on Lord's shoulder and told him to calm down and open the gate so he could come out and look. He looked at the boy and replied that it was too dangerous. But he smiled back and said it was fine and he knew what he was doing. Adding that he might be a freshman, but he was still a necromancer. At the same time Elizabeth stood in the middle of the army of spiders, looking thoughtfully at where Simon stood on the wall. The protagonist came down from the wall and stood alone before the girl and asked her what had brought her here. Simon Valencia, son of the former commander Richard Valencia. I Elizabeth wished to serve you as my master. Then bending down on her knee and lowering her head, she asked him in a humble voice to allow her to join his battalion. And also to take the test. Looking up at the sunny blue sky, Simon turned to Elizabeth and said that if she wanted to join his battalion, she had to fulfill some conditions. Turning his gaze to the happy townsfolk, to whom the Lord happily informed that Kizen had sent a necromancer and everything was now settled, he said that the first condition was that she must not kill people without his permission. The second was that she must not harm anyone close to him. Continuing to look out the window of the building at the square. He turned around and said that the third condition was that she obeyed him no matter what it cost her. Standing opposite him, Elizabeth contemplated going to hell of her own free will again. The contract was unpleasant and constraining, and she realized that she might have an unhappy future ahead of her. Even so, she did not regret the choice she had already made. She would have made the same choice in any other opportunity, for what she had experienced that day would remain in her heart forever. Bowing her head and placing her hand on her chest, she promised that she would tolerate anything as long as she had the opportunity to be with him, and that he could also limit her freedom as much as he saw fit. Adding that her body and soul belong only to him. Listening to all this, Feo shook his head and told himself that she was definitely into him. And he was not mistaken, for the next moment Elizabeth looked at Simon in love and said that for her loyalty she wanted only one thing, and that was his love. She grabbed his hand with her own and said that she would do whatever he wanted, but that she wouldn't force herself on him, because it was enough for her that he simply cared for her. Simon didn't realize what he was getting into, but he agreed. He thought to himself, noting that although she had become obedient, he was now a little uncomfortable. Hearing his answer, she pressed his hand to her breast with a happy face and asked him impatiently why they should not go to the conclusion of the contract. He was clearly unprepared for such pressure, and embarrassedly replied that she was too close. Blushing and closing his eyes, Simon waited for the contract to be signed. As soon as it was done, the darkness was dispersed by a burst of energy. Continuing to cradle his hand to her breast, Elizabeth with a warm smile on her face pondered how he could be so adorable. As soon as they were done, Feyre turned to her and welcomed her back to the battalion. Feyre looked at her hand and said that she hadn't been contractually bound to anyone for a long time. Then turning to Simon, to whom her words were hitting the sore spot, she said that he was now incredibly weak, and that Feyre had become weaker under his influence. But putting her hand on her chest and closing her eyes, she said that despite this, the darkness warmed and soothed her mind. Not wanting to waste any more time, or feeling awkward, Simon said that they should move as quickly as possible, since Ellen was waiting for them. Taking such haste to mean that he was offended by her words, Elizabeth said she would comfort his wounded heart. To which he replied excitedly and awkwardly that he didn't need it. When they arrived at the place where Ellen was waiting for them, Simon greeted her and thanked her for her work. She smiled happily and asked how they liked her acting, which everyone seemed to have bought into, to which he smiled and said that she had done a great job. Opening a wooden chest, he showed her several bags of coins. Seeing them, the girl was surprised, while Feyre said in a disgruntled voice that there was much less than he had originally wanted to get. To which Ellen replied that it was still 10 times the original reward. She was more surprised, however, when Simon handed her one of the bags of gold and told her that it was for her. He smiled and said yes, because she needed to help her family too. Taking the bag of money, Ellen tearfully thanked him, saying she would never forget his kindness. When she said she was glad to help, he asked her where she was going now. The girl replied that she was heading back to the Holy Federation, to a place called Locharen. Then with a firm voice she added that if they were ever in the Holy Federation and needed help, they could always turn to her. After smiling and thanking her for the offer, Simon said that he hoped that the next time they would meet would not be on the battlefield. Hearing his words, Ellen replied that he was too cold. Looking at Ellen, who was waving goodbye, Feyre turned to the protagonist and said that he not only let the priestess go alive, but also gave her money, and asked why he did so. He waved back at the girl and told the battalion commander that when he was in his later year of training, he would probably take black assignments. He thought it would be a good idea to get some connections by then. Adding that besides, if she was given some money, she would probably make the perfect accomplice. Looking at Simon, Feyre replied that he had indeed bought her trust. To which he replied that he knew he would understand him. Elizabeth, standing behind him, continued to look at the protagonist with a loving gaze, thinking that he was the best. The battalion commander said that when he looked at his actions, he couldn't tell if he was a good guy or a bad guy. Simon asked if he had to be good or bad, adding that he got half of his blood from a priestess, so he didn't want to hate someone just because they were a priest. It didn't make sense for him to resort to extreme measures, after all he only had to do what was necessary. Although Feyre couldn't fully understand such thinking, he couldn't help but agree with it. Looking at the carefree-looking Simon, he said to himself that it would take him a while to realize what kind of person he was. Then turning to him, he asked if he was going to go back immediately. The protagonist replied that since he still had plenty of time, he would like to train before returning, because it would be hard for him to use the battalion's power when he returned to Kizen. Hearing his answer, Feyre agreed with him, saying that it was a great idea, and suggested that he train at Elizabeth this time. Hearing this, she replied thoughtfully that it was a good idea. Calling some spiders to her, she turned to Simon and said that since he was her new master, he should know how to control her children. Then adding that therefore she would teach him the basics of undead spiders, corpse spiders. Hearing the words about the new skill, the one's eyes immediately shone with anticipation, and he happily replied that he was looking forward to it. She began her explanation by saying that the corpse spider's main ability was the web that it threw at its opponents. It was a deterrent skill, but it was also versatile as it helped them move around along with it. Finished with the theory, she suggested Simon shoot the web at a tree. Concentrating, he followed Elizabeth's advice and told the spiders to act. Following his order, they immediately released the web, which the next moment flew